She is George and Harriet Thumbnail Endowed Chair of Religions. She's director of the Jewish program. She's also director of the India and South Asia. India and South Asia Center at Rollins College in Florida. She's here in Mumbai as a Fulbright Nehru Scholar. She's going to be with us with this center at Sumaya Vidyamaya till May. And she's teaching a course with us on the body and religion. Her book is here also. And this course actually examines through the lens of religion the whole issue of the body, the problematic issue of the body, the mind-body disconnect, you know, and how may we sort of, how tradition has looked at it, how we tend to look at it. And we are also using this lens of the body and religion to reflect on gender. And while she was teaching this course with us from January, Professor Rathore came up with this book of his called A Philosophy of Autobiography, in which again he looks at the body and the, as he calls it, the representation of the body and the lived physical experience. The body really as a locus of our experience, how we tend to ignore it or how we tend to explain it. And his search has been through the autobiographies of several famous personalities. So we had these two teachers who are with us and whom we are very fond of, and they worked on something that we thought would lead to a very interesting dialogue. And I don't want to stand here anymore. Over to you, Nancy.
Welcome everyone. I know some of you, and I'm very looking forward to meeting and getting to know others in this audience, at least through a dialogue with the audience after some brief comments and maybe dialogue with our author. I'm delighted, actually I was delighted when Supriya asked me to have this event, to have this dialogue with Aakash, and was not only because of his book, but just in general. I'm familiar with some of his work on Hegel, and I'm also through the relationship with Samaya. We just shared, we had also a panel on religion and gender a few weeks ago. So there are some interconnections, and that, of course, would be wonderful to further pursue with him. So Supriya offered me the book to look at, and really, I have to say, Aakash, I've been really intrigued and moved by so much of what you've written here. Of course, some of the characters are particularly close to my heart. For example, Elie Wiesel, of no surprise, right? Being actually a descendant of Holocaust survivors, not directly, but through uncles and aunts, and actually most of whom actually did not survive. But at any rate, I have a particularly close somatic experience with Holocaust survivors. So that chapter absolutely was phenomenal. It was written really quite phenomenally, very sensitively, very insightful. I really appreciated that. So, but of course, so you've created such a rich book of 12 different autobiographies, or 12 figures who have written their autobiographies. Where do I begin? I'd like to ask you a question. One question would be, how did you pick this cover? How and why did you pick this cover, right, Hemingway, as the cover of your book? You could have picked others, right? But so, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. Does this work?
Yeah.
Thank you, Yudit, and thanks for this event. Bookstores are, for me, since a child, sacred places. So whenever I walk into one, I feel uplifted somehow. It's really remarkable to be able to discuss a book of my own and a book of that I really appreciate in environment. The cover is an interesting story, and I'm wondering if I should tell the truth. The truth is much less exciting than.
Okay. Well, then in that case, fake it.
So, but there are two issues. I mean, maybe the truth is more exciting, and I don't want to admit it, because the truth of this is that photographs are all copyrighted, and they're extremely expensive to reproduce. So there are, I think, some wonderful photos in the book. Especially, I like the one from Mouse and Persepolis and Andy Warhol as well. But for example, in negotiations with Maya Angelou, I was not able to get a photograph of her for less than, I think they wanted $700 or something like that, which was an amount of money that, as much as I admired her, I was not willing to get. And the Hemingway one came for free. So there are a few things about it. One is the idea he's looking at himself, he's admiring himself in a mirror. So the mirror is representative of autobiographical writing, self-representation. And what is it that he's looking at? I've always wondered, because he was a very macho person, and he's got his chest pumped out like this. And so he's more or less representing himself in this image the way he wants to represent himself in his writing and in his public persona. So I found this to be quite indicative of at least one way that autobiographical writing works. And the fact that it was free was really what sealed it. But there's another thing, because I've spoken about this book several times, and there's one friend of many of us, Dr. Peter Mehta, who has come up with a running hypothesis that I don't really know what's happening. I, the author, don't really know what's happening in this book, and that the book functions at a level that I'm not consciously aware of. So there's a lot of unconscious work going on here. And so if she's right, then that gives another indication that
yeah, I get it. But you know, I mean, so let's switch to your other someone who you greatly admire. In fact, you say you worship. I was really taken aback by that, but that's honest. That's honesty, right? That's truth. I'm talking about Yukio Mishima and his gorgeous body. I mean, Hemingway. Kind of, yeah. But so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about him. I mean, why? I mean, so the idea is that he perfected both his intellect and his body. And that's the reason, right, why you so admire him and to the point of worshiping him and maybe wanting to emulate him. And so, is this really what we should all strive for? Is this something obviously not realistic? And we know that most philosophers are not the best looking or have the best bodies, but they have great minds, and I think that's great. But why insist and why press us towards that sort of perfected being, the Übermensch, that we, that is, it's possible for some to attain, but it's so hard for most of us to even relate to.
Yeah, that's Mishima is what made me want to become, who made me want to become a writer, and so there's a very close relationship to him. The thing is that Mishima was a deeply flawed person, so much so that towards the end of his life he did some fanatical things, many fanatical things, terrorist acts, and ultimately suicide, like Hemingway. In fact, Mishima was aware of Hemingway's suicide and found it so vulgar that he used an instrument like a shotgun. And I don't know if I write about it in the book, but he even called a friend, an American journalist living in Japan, and said, "Please explain to me why the greatest writer of our generation used such a terrible instrument. Doesn't he know how to use a sword?" So just to, the worshipping part of Mishima is precisely because of his flaws, not because of his perfection. I'll tell one funny story. I mean, there is a lot of unconscious things going on here. In my bedroom, in my house in the U.S., which is next door to my sister's house, I have a photograph of Mishima hanging in the bedroom. In fact, the one that's
That same one?
Yeah. When my sister first saw it, she said, "Aakash, I've known you're gay for many, many years. Now you need to come to terms with it." So, which I don't think I am, but not that it would bother me. But there is this sort of this sort of very, very close identification with Mishima. But it's not so much because of the perfection. He's a far greater writer than I could ever dream of being. He was far greater athlete. I mean, well in his 30s he started sword fighting, and immediately within a few years qualified for Japan's Olympic team and won a medal. It doesn't happen if you don't start in your teens generally. So he was, yeah. So he was extraordinarily gifted, both physically and intellectually. But his personal story is filled with sadness, incompleteness, his homosexuality, which he was always struggling with throughout his life, and he's building up this muscular side of him. The bodybuilding started because of being rejected by his homosexual lovers as too intellectual and so on. So he said, "I'll show them," and then he became this great sword fighter. So these are the things that I admire about him: his story, his struggle, the brilliance with which he writes, and his achievements. It's not so much what's represented in this picture. This picture is, in some way, just a fleeting moment of what he aspires to be. But it's not too long after this picture that he kills himself.
There's so much tension here in your answer, and not just in your answer, but in the book. When we think about, let's talk a little bit about God, because God is not hardly ever mentioned, right? And the perfection, this striving for perfection. I mean, isn't that what we sort of impose upon a deity, right? I mean, that sort of perfection. And we, in comparison, are just, you know, mortal, limited, imperfect, flawed beings, human beings. But anyway, so that's just one thought. So how do we move? So I have so many other questions.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, sure, sure.
Because this is one thing. Your book is amazing. I read it the last time for the seminar. One thing that I was wondering about was in the Maya Angelou chapter. I don't know if you were able to.
Yes, I did read it.
So I discussed Maya Angelou's preoccupation with the color of her skin and feeling alienated from representations of God in the American Christian tradition. Always white hair, always male, and so on. And this is something that I've been preoccupied with for years and years and years and years. The tones that we use on our own gods and goddesses, and the whiteness of God in the American tradition. And an Ethiopian friend in college took me to his house, and it was the first time I saw the black Jesus and the Last Supper, all black. The disciples, all black. And when I saw it, I finally felt a religious feeling for the first time in my life about Christianity. All the time I felt Christianity was very oppressive and sort of racial, filled with racism and patriarchy and issues like this. And for the first time I felt it was liberating. So that's part of why my Angelou's story was so interesting. I don't talk about God so much in the book, except the Elie Wiesel, out of just sheer wonder how he can have found God again. What I want to ask you about, in the book, I didn't notice that you were too concerned with this racial side.
Correct.
What do you think about the black Jesus or the representation of God as of a specific race?
Right.
So, first of all, for me as a Jew, God does not have a body. So the fact that God is represented as body, whether it's black, white, brown, goddess, a woman, a female, is all just very foreign. But by now, I mean, was foreign, I should say, because once I started studying religion, history of religions and comparative religion, I've had to come to terms and get to know some intimate details about these various bodies that were the representations of various deities across cultures. Obviously, race does not figure prominently in the book, precisely because, although I do mention, obviously, the whiteness of Jesus based on European art, and make a note of it, but the point of the book is really to highlight the role of religion in representing, and of course religion here, even though it's integral to culture, right, as you know, what I emphasize in the chapter on representing the divine body, the focus was more on different traditional sort of mainstream representation of whether it's Jesus or Durga and so on, without necessarily going into sort of explicating the connection between culture and society, the artists who are in fact representing these various deities. But it's very interesting to me, and it's very important to me to point out that the whiteness of Jesus in the eyes of brown and black people is definitely a problem that could, I mean, once you really think about it, as a black person, I too would have a major issue with it, and I might not, depending on my circumstances, right, my embodied particular birth body, I may or may not choose to follow the white Jesus if I was a black woman. But the same goes for feminist theologians who refuse to follow a male God, precisely for that. Or a solely male God, as Mary Daly and other Christian feminists have done. They've said, no, there's no way that we can follow a God who is only represented as a male. And one of her comments is, if God is male, then male is God, which is something that she concluded and then went off to move away from Christianity altogether.
So, and then if I can just ask one more, maybe I'm wondering what I have not yet asked any theologian about the way that I appropriate the John. The word became flesh.
Oh, yes, okay, I have a comment on that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it's, is it offensive? Is it workable? Is it just, what would you say?
Definitely. I mean, for somebody who is interested in autobiography and in philosophy, how can you not, right? How can you ignore the phrase from the book of John, right, in the New Testament, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, right, with reference, kind of almost sort of recreating the creation story from, moving away from Genesis, right, because in Genesis we have a God who creates the world through speech, through the Word, as it says, let there be light, and there was light. That was the end of the first thing, and so on, right? So, God creates the world through words, through speech, which, by the way, I have a lot to talk about and to say about that in itself. But then in Christianity, you have the Gospels, right, are working together independently of each other, but also as a in a unified kind of way to theologize, right, the being of Jesus, right? So we go from, and to impress upon us the importance, the primacy of his having been born a human from God, right? The Virgin Mary and so on, right? I mean, this was all a miracle, metaphysical kind of event, supernatural, right? Because as far as I know, I mean, no virgin has ever given birth. So I think it's really interesting that you work with it. Which chapter was this?
Well, it's the note at the beginning, and then I think I mentioned it.
Yeah. And so you're contrasting that with what with your project, which is fascinating. There's a really nice kind of inversion when you say that in secular autobiography, the flesh is made word. So, I wanted to ask you about that. Is there such a thing as secular autobiography? But clearly, those folks who are writing their autobiographies, who have written their autobiographies about whom you wrote your book, from that philosophical mind-body dualism, right, perspective. What was the role of religion, not so much religion, but in what sense did spirituality as opposed to embodiment, but here we go, we are working with that dualism, but in what sense did their spirituality inform their lives and their autobiography?
Oh, this does work. I was convinced this wasn't working. You were just being nice. So there's one thing you mentioned just in passing that I want to say, which I found really stunning. Did you notice that within the first, I think, 5 or 6 pages of both of these books, we talk about Descartes and dualism? This is just something that is really preoccupying anybody who works on the body, irrespective of which way you go from it. So the preoccupation with this, what this man had done to all of us, the concept of dualism, it's just in the first, within 3 or 4 pages in your book, and same in mine. So the Gandhi chapter in Philosophy of Autobiography, so when I use this word secular autobiography, I was more or less trying to suggest that autobiographies that are not religious confessions and things.
Like, for example, Autobiography of a Yogi?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So Paramahansa or St. Augustine, these sorts of books, of which there are so many. So in the Gandhi chapter, I do this quite harshly, because the way, even the term Mahatma, the way that every book about Gandhi, what I'm trying to do in the book is say, this is what tradition has passed along, and it's hiding, it's part of why we don't have access to the body, and we treat it as, in terms of these classical dualisms, light and dark, male and female, spirit and flesh, mind and body. So part of the fixation of representing the spiritual is what lends credence to being locked into the binaries. So consequently, in the one case where Elie Wiesel I leave alone because it's more fascinating the direction he goes, because that's not the one I would have taken for sure. Don't have the strength to praise God after hours. This is something that takes a remarkable strength. But for Gandhi, I wanted to show people that God in Gandhi is somatic. It's the body is the crucible through which, or without which, there is no access to God. And he gives hints throughout his life that his biographers and especially philosophers like to push those aside and focus on the spiritual, transcendent nature. But Gandhi's own articulation of his life is that's not where greatness of soul resides. He himself states that the reason he's not a Mahatma is because he can't resist drinking milk. Goat's milk specifically. And how do you make sense of that if we're talking about the realm of the spirit and so on? There's got to be something somatic, something very material, something very basic going on with which he is preoccupied. And in order to understand his life story without doing violence to his own conception of the centrality of the body for spirit, we need to linger in the realm of the flesh and of the physical and the somatic.
So for Gandhi, and would you say for you, God would be, I mean, it is replaceable for truth with a capital T?
Yeah, I spent some time deconstructing that concept with Gandhi talks about. For me, I don't get into this
Sort of involuntary and unconscious philosophy. But what manner of philosophy? Certainly not one replete with abstractions. Rather, one of constant specificity, a plenum of lived experiences. What we discover is that the body is ever present as the mediator, vehicle, conduit, crucible of lived experiences. Like some bizarre somatization of Kantian epistemology, it's the body that somehow functions analogous to the categories of the understanding and the pure forms of intuition, space and time, both to constitute and condition the subject in its relation to the world, and the world in its relation to the subject. While it may be bizarre to try to reformulate this idea in Kantian terms, it's not alien to the Aristotelian perspective at all. That is, apparent in Aristotle's Ethics, the poet, a great-grandmother, her two sisters, and Mahatmaji. That's there's a quotation. Will Mahatmaji approve? Whispered the old ladies of the household hold to one another at the beginning of any activity. It was as if Mahatma Gandhi was the head of the Nalanda house. His photographs hung in every room. Even the servants felt his presence in the house and began wearing collars. So the Kamala Das's Viceroy articulates the way that Mahatma Gandhi, not one of the actual occupants, was in some respects one of the most important occupants of that house, governing and sort of guiding the behavior of all of the people in the household. When I mentioned that I keep Mishima's picture on my room, to be very, very honest, when I wake up in the morning, I look at it and I think, this person did so much. Am I just going to lie in bed and lazy one more day? It gets me, gets me popped out of bed. So in this way, each of these writers in the autobiography function in some way to wake us up to something real and powerful in the world. And interestingly, each of them also orient us in some certain way back to our basic material conditions, basic constraints, our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our class, our caste, all of these are the reasons that I chose these people, because they reflect various aspects that we all share in some respect. I'm not a very good reader.
So today I'm trying, I think you opened up a way of looking at it in a more integrated way today in the course of listening to you. And that is via the whole problematic of the body, which is what the book, I think, professes to do. So in a way, I think what I found interesting about the book is that there are so many diverse authors that you're dealing with, that is one. And also the intersection between philosophy, because when we look at philosophy, autobiography, I've discussed this several times, philosophers tend to undermine the autobiographical mode, although Cartesianism rules, and this is a big paradox. So I think I found this book to be a little more specific, that it is getting rid of Cartesianism in the course of emphasizing autobiography. And this part I found very interesting. Now, the other thing is that our body, and you brought up in the course of your reading, the way we wear our body and the way our body is seen as a testimony. This is, I think, true of, I think, everybody, that there is a certain way in which women wear their bodies, or are, to quote Heidegger, are bodily, because I don't have a body, I am bodily. There is a way in which Dalits carry their body. So I think to a great degree this whole testimony surrounding the body, can one say is also a reflection of society to an extent, and also a reflection that I don't really have that type of control. Since you start with Judith Butler, that there is no doer before the deed. So I don't have a control over the body, since to some degree the stories are already to an extent written by the people around me. And so, in which case what happens to agency? I was thinking, listening to you, where would you posit agency?
Thank you, Katrina.
If I can just add
Yeah,
a
please.
little bit to that, because I have a related question of what the socially constructed body, right? And particularly in the Indian context, and in the context of what you've been teaching us, this whole thing of caste. And I haven't deliberately read the Ambedkar one because I wanted to hear you for the workshop, and then I'll read it. But in that, is there in his autobiography, if you could tell us, are there clues? Obviously, when you're called, whatever it is that he may have been called, right, because of the caste issue, and then he becomes this phenomenally erudite person, public figure, intellectual, activist. Do you find that change? Did he have agency, and was there a difference? I'm not sure I'm articulating it well, but he would have suffered, I presume, in the socially constructed body situation when he was just a young, helpless person. He had tremendous agency, but do you see it reflected in his lived experience or in the autobiographical?
Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe you have also some things. I'll say something, and if you have one issue is now from the Judith Butler and the Ambedkar. There's one interesting thing about Ambedkar. Ambedkar says he discovered that he was untouchable later in his life. Not very old, but not when he was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's an ironic trajectory, because part of why Ambedkar wrote his autobiographical fragment was precisely the irony that if he is the most educated man in the Indian subcontinent, why does he still get thrown off of a toga or a rickshaw? Why is he still bullied and beaten? Why, when the Pune Pact was signed, did people on Gandhi's side get purified with Ganga water from the Ganga because they had signed the pact they were untouchable? So Ambedkar is himself desirous to articulate to an audience that whereas you think that I, due to exercising my agency and my capacities, have transcended what anyone would attribute to a Dalit in terms of impurity and lack of education and so on. Nothing allows the Dalit body to transcend that as far as the Savannah Hindus are concerned. So his autobiography is in fact a testament to contradict our normal assumption that if these people would just become educated and clean and proper, then we wouldn't have any problem. The irony is that that's precisely what he was, and their problem grew greater, more profound, and more hostile. Now, so this question of agency is odd because it's not parallel. And I also, as I mentioned, Judith Butler, reading that book a long time ago changed my life quite significantly. But I think I disagree about the performative component and how reductive it is. So what what I want to point out is that we are all materially and socially and other ways conditioned. Even if we're not naturally conditioned by gender, let's say you want to take that route, we are socially conditioned by the condition that is put on gender naturally. So irrespectively, we are conditioned by innumerable things, whether it's merely social or in fact natural. So the question becomes, how is it possible to find agency if one realizes that one's identity is constructed by class, one's consciousness is constructed by caste and gender, and the institutions that are there to liberate us, education for example, just imposes more normativity and more socialization. So ironically, the very institutions that are supposed to allow us to transcend our conditions are the ones that entrench us deeper into it. And that happens architecturally, by the way that you put the chairs of students facing the authority figure who's usually on a raised dais and so on. So our bodies are always formed by institutions to replicate whatever it is socially that is our bodies are, our identities are supposed to be. It's reinforced everywhere. So where does agency come from? I think the answer lies in a passage in Aristotle's Ethics, where he argues that irrespective of all of the constraints that we face, if we can say no to anything, that means that we can also say yes to something unknown, unheard, and unimagined. And I think why I keep talking about Aristotle is because Aristotle says, so where are we supposed to get some sort of access to some image that allows us to transcend the almost all-consuming socialization that institutions and other persons and families and everything constantly mold us into. And his suggestion is an untranslatable word. Nobody has been able to translate this word spoudios in Greek. They say serious person, but that's absurd because, you know, for a stand-up comedian, the spoudios would be a comic character, right? Charlie Chaplin is a spoudios for someone who wants to be a great comedian. So serious isn't very good. So I took spoudios to mean the exemplarity or archetype represented by people who transcend our social location. So through autobiography, I believed, or other sorts of narratives, testimonies, testimonials, whatever, that come to us from outside of our space and time, that come to us outside of our social location, our historical location, our gender identities, things like this. They come to us from afar. They offer some sort of light that allows us to see that things can be other than the conditions that we're totally consumed by. I think this is partly why I choose so many different people from, you know, this is just 12. You know, I have 2 more autobiography books coming, so there are 36 people that I have in mind. You know, I can think readily of 36 people who make me realize that, you know, I should be more creative. I should be less sensitive to the constant imposition of normativity on what it means to be a man, what it means to be a professor, what it means to be an Indian, what it means to be this caste, what it means to be that class. That the possibility of waking up outside of the institutions that constantly shape us, our family, our friends, our teachers, our taxi drivers, you know, all of these things reinforce our identities to us, not allowing us to break free. But